What's up, everybody? Welcome into another edition of SSPN Offseason. And you guys can see by the title, this is titled The Final Spurs Draft Plus Trades Preview. I'm sure in the future, next season, or at some point during the trade deadline, we will revisit this, Ethan. But this is probably going to be the last time we talk about big trades. Well, I say this, God, good golly, watch. Well, I think the Laurie Markkinen trade rumors last year kind of started around July, August. So we're probably not completely out of the woodworks with those, but at least for like a month, we'll say, we'll kind of turn our focus to free agency and everything else, the summer league and stuff like that after the draft. And of course, there's been so many storylines that have been flying around for a little bit, Ethan, that we've been talking about. But the biggest news that's kind of come out since our last episode is right here from The Athletic from yesterday. Out of Kevin Durant's preferred trade destinations, league sources tell The Athletic that he specifically wants to play for the San Antonio Spurs. Now, Shams Charania has also tweeted that the Rockets and the Timberwolves are also still players in this. Forgive me if I'm forgetting any other names. You can jump in and correct me here, Ethan. But it kind of seems like since the get-go, there was also the Sam Amico report from a couple weeks ago that we talked about that said KD preferred the Spurs. Of course, going back to that year where we were trying to get him when we were competing with the Warriors as well, on top of just some comments that KD has made over the years that have been favorable to the Spurs and the likes of Greg Popovich and stuff like that. I do kind of feel like, at least from an outside perspective, from our perspective here, watching everything online and everything like that, it seems like regardless of where this ends up going, that KD's preferred destination is San Antonio out of all of them are left. Now, does that mean that that's going to be the best deal for Phoenix? We'll have to wait and see. But what are your thoughts on this coming out? Because there's another tweet that I'm going to pull up here right afterwards that came out like an hour or came out earlier today that's kind of contradicting everything. And that just kind of ties into a bigger theme of everything we've been seeing with this since all of these rumors have started.
Yeah, I think it was Spurs Report was the Twitter page that I saw earlier today. I think they summed it up pretty well, Jude. And this has been absolutely exhausting as a fan. It feels like every hour we're getting a different headline, different teams in the lead. I think the latest was that the Timberwolves are not in the running because KD said he did not want to play for the Timberwolves. So it's Miami, Houston, and then the Spurs as his alleged first option. And, it feels great to be wanted, right? As a fan base that's historically not been chased by big name free agents or it's not been a trade destination, since I've been alive. It's nice to be wanted by a guy like Kevin Durant, right? And I think, like we discussed in previous episodes, we think it fits on paper. We like the trade package of like a Devin pick 14, Harrison Barnes to make the money work for Kevin Durant, but I don't know if right now that's the best package that Phoenix has been offered. It sounds like Miami and Houston are offering them a better package, which, as someone who doesn't know their rosters like I do the Spurs roster, I find that sort of hard to believe just by looking at the names. Maybe I'm missing something, but like I don't think there are that many players on either of those teams that are that much better with higher upside than like a Devin Vassell, Harrison Barnes, and a 14th overall pick. I could be wrong. In the comments, if you're fans of those teams, you can prove me wrong. Please feel free to do so. But I think I prefer my trade rumors, Jude, to be sudden and quick. I don't like this one that's been just completely drawn out for so long. But also, I feel like the Suns are probably asking way too high a price, and we saw that the Spurs declined a trade offer from the Suns. I don't know if you saw this today. The Spurs proposed, or the Suns proposed Castle and the number 2 overall pick straight up for KD. Obviously, the Spurs said no. So if that's what they're asking from us, I can only imagine what they're asking from Houston, Miami. So it sounds like in the next couple of days, they're really going to have to lessen the price of Kevin Durant.
Well, I think that's a great point that you hit on there at the end. They could be, and there could be other teams that are, starting with a certain offer. And then, once they actually get into negotiations, they're like, okay, this player's a little bit more off limits than we let on, just so they could get in the door. There's so many different things that could happen there, Ethan. But the other thing, like you said at the end, I think that this could change. If this gets drawn out a little bit longer, then Phoenix's asking price could decrease. But I think it's ironic that you brought up the number 2 and pick in Stephon Castle, because I'm pretty sure we had a comment from a Suns fan last episode saying you guys are trying to trade for peanuts. Everything starts with that if we're trading for KD. But I think from the jump, not only was the number 2 pick off limits in that discussion, but definitely Stephon Castle. He's been off limits, since the De'Aaron Fox trade that we saw at the trade deadline, Ethan. But
Mm-hmm.
as much as that has come out, this will be the last like little version of just all of the contradictory rumors that we're continuing to see. I don't know how else to describe it, man, but let me bring up this article for you. This came out at 2:00
I saw
today
this. Yeah.
from Real GM. The Spurs are stocking assets for a future star trade over the Kevin Durant pursuit. And, if the asking price stays the same, I can 100% believe that. But really, the bigger reason that I'm bringing this up is I'm just trying to bring up like the most latest stuff that I've kind of seen. So we'll go ahead and read through this here. The San Antonio Spurs are believed to be preserving trade assets for a bigger acquisition that better fits their timeline instead of aggressively pursuing Kevin Durant from the Phoenix Suns during this current transaction cycle. The Spurs appear reluctant to pursue aggressive trade talks, despite being included on the veteran forward's preferred destination list. San Antonio believes their championship timeline differs significantly from other contending teams in pursuit of the 14-time All-Star. I guess you could say definitely for like Minnesota. Miami is another name that's been thrown around. Those timelines are completely different. And you could argue that the Rockets is a little bit different, but that's definitely pretty similar to ours. Phoenix has concentrated trade negotiations on all those teams that I just mentioned. Um, the Spurs joined Miami and Houston as Durant's favored destinations, according to NBA insider Shams Charania. That was the other thing. I guess it came out that he doesn't want to play in Minnesota as much as that. That was a tweet that I saw. Again, y'all forgive me there for the exact reporting that came from, but I remember seeing that. So as much as they're still in the discussion, it does seem like Houston and San Antonio are probably the most realistic of the teams that he wants to go to, as much as Miami is still a player. Um, but essentially, as I'm reading this more, this is kind of just all going off of what Shams Charania said, and it just kind of ties into the timeline. So I'll read this last little quote here that kind of has to do more with the Spurs. With that front office, Brian Wright as general manager and Mitch Johnson as head coach, they want to have a similar run and be set up similarly to R.C. Buford and Greg Popovich, who wouldn't want to be. In their minds, they have a ton of assets to where if a guy becomes available on that timeline, potentially you go out and make the deal. It's not to say they don't have interest in KD. They do, and potentially they would make an offer, and I'm sure they have discussed different frameworks. What other teams are offering is a little bit more aggressive. So that kind of goes back to the point, and again, this could be totally through Spurs colored glasses, but if some of those teams are offering that's a little bit more aggressive, kind of changes when it really gets down to the nitty gritty of making the deal, maybe that could reopen a possibility for this deal, in like a couple days, or like maybe the draft next week. It would not surprise me if this gets drawn out into literally draft day. And even if it's not the Spurs who end up making the deal, it wouldn't surprise me if it ended up just playing out until then, just because of, behind closed door, leverage negotiation type stuff.
For sure. And honestly, let's be honest. The Spurs are in a fantastic position. Like they have all the leverage. KD wants to be a Spur. The Spurs will make an offer. I'm sure they will stay extremely conservative, and I'm fine with that. As a fan of KD and as a fan of the Spurs, I want KD really bad, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of fans on Twitter right now that really want KD. But the Spurs front office are probably like, yeah, that'd be nice if we can get it for this. If not, wipe our hands, and we're totally fine. We'll save our picks for another day. And that makes
What's
sense.
Yeah, for sure. 100% agree with you. Just to wrap up this KD discussion, what's the most that you would give up for KD?
That's honestly it. Harrison Barnes, Devin Vassell, the 14th pick, and maybe a protected first in the future. But that is it because he is 36. He is, coming 2 years left in his contract, I believe, Jude, right? Um,
Yes, one of those is a player option, I believe. It's a player or team option, regardless. But I'm pretty sure it's a player option, and he'll accept it because it's north of 50 million.
It's a financial commitment. It's a draft capital commitment, and it might not work. It might blow up in our face. So I'm not giving up more than that.
I would be willing to throw in Keldon as well if it really
Yeah.
came down to it.
Yeah, I think
Um,
we would probably have to take an additional player back, though, wouldn't we? For money.
at that point, you know what? That's a really good point. Yeah, so they probably won't even roll with that. I guess then maybe put it to you this way: if they would prefer to have Keldon over Harrison Barnes,
Yeah, I would do that.
I'd be willing to do it as well. And I don't want to do that. You see the Keldon Johnson jersey right behind there. We've been some of the biggest, like Keldon Johnson, I guess you could say, defenders, over the past couple seasons with a lot of the fans' frustrations with him. Um, but if it came down to it for KD, I would be willing to give up both Devin and Keldon. For a player of his caliber, especially, I know he's 37, but we've talked about the fit, not to harp on this forever, but not only does he bring size and length and helps out our front court, but he also brings that shooting that we desperately need, kind of from just an off-ball sniper at that wing position that we've been discussing potentially looking at in the draft with the 14th
Hmm.
pick.
Yeah, I don't know what Malachi Branham is worth either, but if he's worth something because he's technically a first round pick relatively recently, I'll throw him in there too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I guess that's really my main final thoughts on this KD trade, Ethan. We get the news from the Athletic, and then the next day we got people like Real GM coming out and saying, "Oh no, they're keeping all their assets and they're going to save it for later." So I'm just going to wait and see. We'd be down to trade for KD, like we've been saying since the Giannis discussions came out. We'd be
Hmm.
more willing to trade for KD because we don't have to give up as much. The last thing I'll say on this: Sohan is still off limits in this for me,
For me
as
too.
well as the number two and Stephon Castle, obviously.
And Victor.
No, yeah, of course, throw in De'Aaron Fox too.
Yeah, true.
But Ethan, that is not the only trade news that we have today that could potentially involve the Spurs, because here's another Shams tweet. An NBA draft deal from earlier today. The Indiana Pacers are trading their number 23 pick and the rights to Mojave King to the New Orleans Pelicans for Indiana's own 2026 first round pick that they're getting back now that the Pelicans had previously acquired. So now New Orleans has number 7 and number 23 in the draft. I've already seen it a little bit. We got a comment from on one of our community posts earlier today from one of our subscribers saying, I don't know if you saw this, number 23 seems like a spot that Maxime Reynaud. I saw somebody in the comments correcting the pronunciation there. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but that's what he said, Reynaud. That's how he spelled it. And I can see that with the French. So we're rolling with that right now. That could be, a spot where he could definitely be in that range. There's also, of course, the Trey Murphy conversation. A lot of that surrounds number 2, but if we're not trading for KD and the Pelicans, like you said, everybody on their roster is available, and Joe Dumars has been in contact with the Spurs. That was more surrounding number 2, but there definitely have been some discussions there. Maybe there could be a world where we don't give up number 2 and we use 14, some other draft assets, and maybe another player that we throw in to go pursue that Trey Murphy deal. And maybe we can get 23 with that to also bring in somebody like a Maxime or somebody else that we're kind of targeting in that range. I saw in a mock draft today that had the Spurs taking Joan Behringer, the center who, was talked about in the second round, who's now been jumping up, into kind of that range. Maybe he could be available at 23. But again, that's a little bit in the weeds. I guess the bigger thing is, do you think this is setting something up for New Orleans? And do you think this really has any impact on the Spurs?
I don't think it does if it's for the number 2 pick. I really don't think the Spurs are going to trade number 2. If we could somehow move from 14 to 23 and 26 and get 2 players, then great. But I don't think Trey Murphy would be included in that. I think if we want Trey Murphy, it'd have to have some kind of inclusion with the second overall pick. And then obviously we would get more than just Trey Murphy, but I think that's the recipe for him specifically.
Yeah. I guess last thoughts on the number 2 pick. What What are your thoughts on that whole discussion? Do you ever think there was any legitimacy to the Spurs moving that pick? Do you think there are some interesting offers on the table that could be presented that they would maybe consider, or do you think at the end of the day we're just going to sit back and go with Dylan Harper and that was always the plan and this is all just a bunch of smoke?
I'm sure they did their due diligence. I'm sure they analyze probably some pretty good offers. New Orleans is notorious for giving up too much. So I'm sure that they took the time with that, but I honestly don't think the Spurs ever actually considered it. But I have no way of knowing that. I just think
Yeah.
that with the Spurs history and having the second overall pick, it's not like we had like the eighth pick where it's like, okay, we can
Yeah.
this is easier to swallow. This is a second overall pick with a potentially generational ball handling guard to be the future partner with their all time franchise center, Victor Wembanyama. So I don't think it was ever really a discussion.
The one thing I'll say is I remember there was a report about Joe Dumars and how he called up the Spurs and said, what would it take to get to number 2? I'll just say that's the most intriguing like offer or discussion if you want to talk about a trade for number 2. And obviously that would have to include not only Trey Murphy, but probably Herb Jones too, and maybe even some draft capital in there as well. Again, this may be one of those things where we get comments and people are like, that's absurd, but as much as I love Trey Murphy and Herb Jones, if Dylan Harper turns into what he could potentially be, like his full ceiling, that's a potential all NBA guy. And
Mhm.
like I said, as much as I love those guys, those guys aren't all NBA guys. And they weren't the second pick in the draft either. As much as I think Herb Jones was a top 10 pick, if I remember correctly. Well, I think about it.
I'm not sure.
He might have been the lottery. I think they were both lottery guys, but
I'll tell you what I would do, Jude. If we were in a more competitive situation today, like we were just like a couple pieces away from winning a title, I would absolutely trade to Keldon and Devin for Herb, Trey Murphy, DeJounte Murray, and maybe another draft pick. Because then that we immediately have a solution at point guard and the wing positions. That's an upgrade over what Devin and Keldon are today, defensively and as floor spacers. But that's a
yeah,
pipe
I
dream.
I totally no, for sure, for sure. I went ahead and looked up where Trey Murphy was drafted just out of curiosity. He was at 17, and let me see where Herb Jones was at. I'm
I think
pretty
he was
sure
a
he was
second
in the
round
lottery.
pick.
Okay. Of course I look up Herb Jones and they don't give me that. I have to spell out his full name, Herbert. You're right. He was round 2, 35. I don't know what I was on there.
Come on, man.
He feels like a lottery pick with the
He
defense
should
he
have.
plays.
He should have been a lottery pick for sure.
Wow, that was way off. I was thinking of the Virginia days there for Trey Murphy. Um, but yeah, man, when it came to what you were saying, if the Spurs were a little, much closer to a championship at that point, I would 100% be willing to do that. But again, as much as we do feel like we have our big 3, imagine if we had a big 4 with Dylan Harper.
Yeah, it's too much to pass on. I'm afraid.
Yeah, and the other thing as well, I know we've done this at nauseum, but as you guys can see here on the bottom, when it comes to the roster, he would immediately fill that need for a 6-man and a backup point guard. As much as we love our guy Blake Wesley, Ethan, there's always going to be injuries, or there just might be nights where De'Aaron sits out. We can give Blake his reps then. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? He can still have an impact and kind of a role on this team. Or like I said, if there's somebody's out for an extended period of time, he can fill in, continue to kind of grow in the Spurs development system that he's continued to be in, as much as it's kind of been baby steps year to year. Um, Dylan Harper again would immediately probably be the Spurs 6-man, as well as their backup point guard, and maybe long term, can grow into a starting role. I saw there was some other talk on Twitter today that apparently he's already been guaranteed a starting spot. Um, we'll have to wait and see there. But what I will say about that is we've talked about the fit. I'm not opposed to him coming in and playing the 2 immediately next to Stephon Castle and
Mm.
De'Aaron Fox.
Yeah, I wouldn't be against it either.
And trying to just look at what that would be if we do. Well, again, that kind of depends on what happens with the KD trade. If we do trade for KD, then we're probably letting go of Devin Vassell and Harrison Barnes. So I don't know if he would start at that point unless we're starting KD at the 4. If we're starting KD at the 4, then you could have De'Aaron Fox, Dylan Harper, Stephon, and then KD and Victor, and then you move Jeremy to the bench. But you could also have, again, a world where you have Dylan Harper as the sixth man off the bench, being the PG, and then you have KD as the 3, where he'd slide into that starting lineup. So
A lot of versatility, a lot of different options we could play with for sure. Mitch will have a field day.
100%. For all of the Mitch Johnson questions, it's thrown right into the fire right here
Mm,
with whatever we do with these lineups. Even if we don't get KD, there's a lot of questions on, are you going to move Devin Vassell to the bench? We saw him play the 3 at times last season. We've already talked about all this, but definitely Mitch Johnson will be put to the test when it comes to rotations right off the jump.
100%.
Okay, Ethan. Now, with all of that out of the way, there's just a couple more questions to kind of just put a bow on this whole offseason and draft lead up. And of course, we've still got free agency after this, but of course, the draft and potential trades are the biggest thing. But let's just say the Spurs end up don't making a trade for KD and they keep both picks. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you this because I know who you want at number 2. You want Dylan Harper. We've already both agreed to that. But at 14, if we do end up keeping 14, who and of course this is going to depend on who goes before us, and there's always some stuff out of left field that happens in the draft. But just with the knowledge that you kind of have right now, who would you go with at 14 if we keep it?
I think I'm leaning toward Rasheer Fleming. I think the versatility,
Okay,
the defense,
yeah,
the positional fluidity that it brings to the rotation, especially in the bench lineup, I think he could impact the team pretty much right off the bat. So that's who I'm going with 14.
I like not. Well, here, I will say this. I was going to say I like his shooting ability, the numbers that we've seen. I also like that he's
Mm-hmm.
21, so he's not coming in
For
as much
sure.
of a raw prospect. That kind of goes back to what Lou said, in just the sense that you've got your sure thing in Dylan Harper, and obviously he's a guard, and then you can kind of address the front court a little bit more with Rasheer, but it kind of allows you to still have that youth movement while also not picking another project player that can come in and make a little bit more of an impact and kind of impact winning a little bit quicker, which the Spurs are trying to do faster. So I totally hear you there. His combine shooting numbers weren't as good as the percentages, but I still have faith in his stretch ability, as well as the progression that we saw from Stephon Castle this year. On top of the fact that he would just be addressing the front court and fills a need regardless. Everybody's going to need to improve a little bit in some certain area. I don't think that his shooting is starting from somewhere that's like, a bad spot. But I don't mean to harp on that too long. I definitely like a lot of his appeal, as well as the fact that he even can potentially play
Mm-hmm.
some 5. But I'm going to come out with a little bit of a different
Okay.
name, Ethan. We've talked about him a little bit before, and he's been balling out a little bit in the French playoffs as of late. Noah Asengi is who I'm going to go with as my preferred number 14 pick. I actually brought this up here. Let me pull it up. So this is John Chepkovich, who is one of the directors of scouting at Draft Express, Jonathan Cavoni's company. And these were Noah Asengi's anthro measurements from his abbreviated 2025 draft combine in Europe. And so this is a little bit rounded. It's to the nearest quarter inch. So, he's probably he's 6'9" technically, and maybe a 6'11". Well, no, that's 7 foot at least, 7.5 feet, even if there is a little bit of rounding there. But again, you see the measurements on the screen for those of you guys listening on podcast: 6'10" barefoot, 204 pounds, a 7-foot wingspan, a 9.5-inch standing reach. And then here, what's this last thing here at the bottom? Let me adjust this. And a 9 by 10 3 quarter inch hands as well. So definitely measuring a little bit bigger than initially. That's not the only reason though. It's more just his ascension in play kind of near the end of the season in the French league playoffs. He just really reminds me a lot of Bilal Koulibaly. Probably has a little bit more of shooting question marks, you could say. And I know Spurs fans hear that and there's a little bit of a groan. But if you just go watch his jumper, I really think it's got a lot of potential. I think it's better than the percentage. Maybe I'll be proven wrong on that, but Wemby shot sub 30% in the LNB, for example. I think his shooting is playing out just fine. And especially, like I said, kind of down the stretch in the 2 games that I watched recently in the playoffs where he scored at least 19 points, he had 2 threes in both of those games. And he's really kind of showing some strength around the basket as well. It's just kind of like all the flashes that you were seeing, you're starting to see them more as the game's intensity is bigger and are becoming more important. Now, maybe there's some duds in there that I'm missing, but I've definitely been seeing on Twitter that there's been a lot of hype kind of around him in recent games. And of course, you can go on YouTube and kind of see a lot of the highlights just over the past couple weeks with multiple, 15-point plus games and 20-point performances. So with that being said, Ethan, I just think that he can definitely be a modern four coming into the league. He's going to have to put some weight on him, but I think he's just got a lot of potential. And when you have somebody like Dylan Harper that you're picking at number 2, I think it allows for a little bit more kind of that project type player, you could say. He's also the second youngest player in the draft. So I think that, there's just a lot of time that he has to improve. Obviously, there's the French connection as well. So maybe that's playing into it a little bit. But I think because of his measurements, as well as just, his high ceiling, you could say that there's some high variability with the floor there as well. Like, I think I would definitely agree that Asengi has a lower floor than Rasheer Fleming, but I also think he has a higher ceiling. But again, I'm not going to be mad at any of these guys. I wouldn't be mad at Carter Bryant. I wouldn't be mad at Asa Newell. I wouldn't be mad at Thomas Sorber. But if I had to pick my favorite at 14, if we end up keeping it, is Noah Asengi, just because of the way that he's been turning up lately. And like I said, man, he really just reminds me a lot of Bilal Coulibaly. But I think with the measurements that we've got, which is an improvement, it shows that he grew over the past year, which makes sense with how young he is. I think that he really can be a modern four moving forward. So because of that, again, kind of same thing as Rasheer Fleming, except Fleming can kind of play the 5, but positionally and on the roster fit wise, you can slide him into that 4 for sure. He's not just a true 3, which was kind of how I was viewing him before.
I'm not mad at that. Honestly, I love the French connection thing. The ceiling and floor point is 100% true. He definitely has extremes in both directions, but I like his age, and every positive thing that I said about Rasheer is pretty much true for Noah, aside from maybe half court scoring, whether that be spot up threes or just creating your own shot off the dribble. But he could get there because he's got all the measurable traits, like you said. I'm not mad at it either.
And just to, play devil's advocate to myself here, Rasheer's probably a little bit more physical, also just more mature, a little bit more experience as well. But yes, specifically when it comes to the muscle, I think Rasheer's got him on that one. But Noah's been showing it, and he's definitely got the frame where he can continue to grow. And in 3 or 4 years, he could look a lot different than the skinny 18-year-old he is now. But let me see, Ethan. Okay, the other question I had was if we trade to, what's your preferred team/package? But we kind of already talked about that a little while ago. We talked about lineups with KD as well. And we'll get into lineups and everything, once we have some finality with the draft. But the other big topic that we haven't really discussed too much, we've kind of discussed it in spurts. And I've had some of my friends even ask me this, like, when are y'all going to do a free agency preview? And I was like, man, well, we'd love to, but we got to see what happens first at the draft. So then we know the needs that the Spurs have got to address. But just to feed the people here a little bit, I know we've thrown out some names and stuff kind of over time. I think regardless, backup center or the center position in general is going to be something that we're going to have to address. Maybe we do address that in the draft, but even if we address it in the draft, there's still the potential for another roster spot there for that position. So we can talk about that for sure. But what are your thoughts on free agency? And just some names that you're thinking about and the needs that the Spurs need to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've honestly said them before, like 100 times. But like, any backup center, like you said, I know Steven Adams just got picked up. Andre Drummond, if he declines his player option, I'd love a guy like him. It's just a physical bruiser, roller to the rim, rebounding guy. Chris Boucher from the Raptors is also a free agent this summer. He can stretch the floor for us as well as be a physical presence. And then just any 3-and-D wing. What's his name? Malik Beasley with the Pistons had a career year, so we might have to overpay for
Yeah.
him. But if he was someone that was willing to commit to us, I think you have to run for that one because he's an incredible 3-point shooter, a pretty decent defender, and could definitely just be a depth piece for us long term. Because I don't even think he's reached 30 years old yet, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm pretty sure he's still relatively within our age range.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Again, I just wanted to ask you that. I know I was like, we're going to talk about Malik Beasley. We could bring up Naz Reid, but there's a bunch of rumors with him in the Lakers.
Love
Miles
Miles
Turner
Turner.
is another name we've talked about, but I don't think Miles Turner is leaving Indiana after the run that they've had. So again, if y'all have any suggestions in the comments, please let us know. But maybe there's a world, Ethan, where we end up addressing all of this in the draft. I mean, if we keep 14, the 4 is probably going to be addressed. I mean, even if we go with somebody a little bit out of left field that we haven't talked about too much, like a Asa Newell, like that's still going to address the front court in some capacity. So here's the real question, Ethan. Does Bismack Biyombo come back regardless to be the third string center?
I would love welcome Bismack Biyombo back. Honestly, he played pretty well in his little stretch of meaningless games.
You know what I will say? Like, as just with what we saw there as a third string center, I'm
It's not
actually
bad.
cool
I mean,
with
our
it.
third string is going to be bad relative, no matter who we bring back.
Ethan, I've got first of all, you're right. But let me check one thing. There's one name. There's one name that I
He's
forgot
not a
about
free
that I
agent.
can't believe you already know
Is
who
it
I'm
my guy?
thinking. It's your guy.
I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
think
yeah.
he is. Here, let me see. I think I looked at this. Let me look here.
He declined his option for the Suns for this year.
Yeah, he signed a 2-year deal with the
I'm
Utah
thinking about,
Jazz last year. So yeah, I already
dang it.
checked.
Drew Eubanks is who we're talking about, for those of you guys who didn't know.
Is your boy available?
Okay, look, I love my guy Dom. First of all, I don't think he is actually. I love my guy Dom Beasy, but at that point, let's just draft Asa
I was
Newell.
actually talking about Jock Landale, but he is not a free agent,
Oh, wait.
and neither is Dominic Barlow.
Oh,
Damn,
Jock Landale.
can't get
Yeah.
anybody. Where's Brandon Paul these days?
Dewan
Yeah,
Blair.
is Jonathan
Somebody.
Simmons still looking for a job?
Jeff
Jeff Ayers.
Ayers.
Hey, what's the little guy's name that actually had like a really tragic?
I know who you're
Aaron
talking. Aaron
Baines.
Baines.
Bring him back as an assistant coach.
I was gonna say that, and then I was thinking about like you said,
Very
the
tragic.
tragic injury. So I think he might have ended up actually coming back and
He
playing
did
in
for
the
2 years.
Australian
Yeah.
League. Okay, so well, regardless, shout out Aaron Baines, not just for his contributions in the Spurs OG days, but the fact that you came back from an injury like that and were able to play pro ball again 2 seasons, much less one. That's very
I
impressive.
might just be not remembering it because I was 14. But did you know he actually played 70 games, 16 minutes a game for us in 2014-15?
That
I
that actually I
forgot
do
all
remember
about that.
that.
He was a
Yeah,
meaningful player.
he was like the main backup
Who
center.
knew?
Yeah.
Shout
Shout out
out Aaron.
Aaron.
He was really pulling through for us.
He had the
Yeah,
shaved like man
him and
bun.
him and
Yeah.
Tiago holding it
Yeah.
down at the 5.
For sure. Well, just final notes on free agency here. I just hope we get more front court depth. We may not need as much as we think now post draft. We'll have to see how that exactly plays out. But again, if I hate to keep saying this, Ethan, I feel like I say this every episode, but with 14 looking like somebody who's going to play the 4, I just want a backup center. That's all I want. That's
Yeah.
all I'm asking. We've been asking about it for like 2-3 years. We gave Zach Collins more benefit of the doubt than probably anybody should have. And And when I say any, like we, I mean like
Mhm.
you and me specifically. Um, and it did not work out in the way that we hoped it would. So we are still searching for that. And that is, again, honestly, I feel like that was my biggest want coming into the offseason. And the crazy thing is the Spurs are going to bring in like so much more important stuff than a backup center this season. But still, despite that, with Dylan Harper and Kevin Durant dangled in front of my face, I just want clarity that we're going to have somebody who can get rebounds off the bench.
Yeah, if you're gonna give us anything, at least give us that, please, for the love of God.
That is my final thoughts, Ethan.
No,
Any from
sir, that's gonna do
yourself?
it for me.
Well, we will see you guys next week to react to the draft live. I don't think we'll be doing both days. We'll probably just do the first day and get to the 14th pick unless it is already traded to Phoenix or somewhere else by that point. But again, we truly appreciate you guys being with us through all of this. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit that like and that subscribe button below. We appreciate all of the new subscribers. We're like less than 20 subscribers away from 3,000. So we truly appreciate you guys. It means the world to us. And don't forget to follow us on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, at SSPN on YT, at Jude McLaren, and at Ethan_Quintero to stay updated with everything. Turn on that notification bell, go to the post tab. You will see all of the new SSPN content. We appreciate y'all. Go Spurs, go. We'll catch y'all on the next one.